The first thing I noticed was her perfume. It arrived before she did, sharp, expensive, the kind that announces itself like a declaration rather than an invitation. Vivian walked into my living room with that smell, and with the particular posture of a woman who has decided, before sitting down, that the room already belongs to her. She wore a pale cream blouse, pressed without a single wrinkle, and she carried a manila folder the way lawyers carry things, flat against her forearm, casual on the surface, deliberate underneath. My son Thomas stood slightly behind her. He did not meet my eyes. There were others. Thomas's younger brother Daniel had come, which surprised me. He stood near the doorway to the kitchen, with his arms folded and an expression I could not entirely read. Not agreement, not protest, something quietly miserable in between. Mrs. Fuang from next door had knocked 20 minutes earlier to return a bowl I'd lent her last week, and I had asked her to stay for tea. She was still sitting in the corner chair, her hands wrapped around the cup, watching everything with the careful stillness of a woman who understood she was witnessing something she had not been invited to witness. The incense on my husband's altar had burned low. The smoke curled upward in a thin, steady line, and then disappeared into the ceiling, patient and unhurried, the way it always was. Outside, a motorbike passed on the lane. A child called out to someone down the street. The afternoon sounds of the neighborhood came through the window as if nothing unusual was happening inside this room at all. Vivian sat down without being asked. She set the folder on my tea table, between the two cups I had prepared. She looked at me with that expression she had been perfecting for the 3 years she was married to my son, warm enough to be polite, careful enough to reveal nothing. "Mrs. Lamb," she said, "I think it's time we all understood where things stand." I said nothing. I picked up my cup. She opened the folder. There were documents inside, several pages, official-looking, the kind of paperwork that is designed to feel final. She turned one page toward me, so I could see it. I looked at it without touching it. "The retirement accounts," she said, and her voice carried the smooth, practiced confidence of someone who has rehearsed not just the words but the tone. "Thomas contributed to those for over 16 years. The QDRO reflects the court's determination of the marital portion." A pause, brief and deliberate. "Those accounts were never really yours, Mrs. Lamb. You just held them for my husband while he worked." The court agreed. The room was very quiet. Mrs. Fuang set her teacup down without making a sound. Daniel looked at the floor. Thomas still did not look at me. I held my cup with both hands and felt the warmth of it against my palms. The incense smoke continued its slow upward drift. I looked at Vivian's face, the careful composure of it, the precise measure of her confidence, and I thought about a great many things, none of which I said aloud. I smiled. Not the smile of someone who is pleased, and not the smile of someone who has been defeated, something quieter than either. Vivian watched me with a slight shift behind her eyes. She had expected something, an argument, perhaps, or the wounded silence of a woman who did not understand what was being taken from her. What she received instead was a smile she could not interpret, and that uncertainty, small as it was, moved across her expression like a cloud crossing in front of a window. "I understand," I said. That was all I said. She closed the folder. She explained several more things after that: procedural matters, timelines, what Thomas would and would not retain. I listened to all of it with the same attention I had given to difficult patients in my years as a community health nurse, the kind of attention that observes not just what is being said but what is being carefully avoided. Vivian was a woman who understood documents. She understood process and language and the specific power of paperwork delivered with confidence. What she did not understand, what she had never taken the time to understand about me, was that I had been keeping documents of my own. But that comes later. For now, let me tell you who I am and how I arrived at that afternoon. My name is May Lamb. I am 69 years old. I worked as a community health nurse for 31 years in the district where I was born, the same district where I raised my 2 sons, the same district where I buried my husband Min 11 years ago, and where his photograph still sits on the altar in my living room, framed in dark lacquered wood, surrounded by the small offerings I refresh each morning: a cup of tea, a tangerine when I have one, a single stick of incense. Min was a quiet man. He believed in doing things correctly the first time and in keeping careful records of everything he touched. He said once, when Thomas was still in secondary school, and had lost an important document for the third time. That a piece of paper is only as safe as the person who understands its value. I thought about that often in the months that followed Vivian's visit to my living room. I thought about it every time I opened the metal box I kept in the cabinet beneath Min's altar. The box where I had stored, without ever quite knowing why, the documents Thomas had once asked me to hold on to when he and Vivian had moved into their new apartment and had no safe place yet for paperwork. He had handed them to me in a plastic sleeve. Retirement account statements, he said. Just until we get settled. They had never asked for them back. I want to be clear about something. I am not a woman who plans for conflict. I am a woman who spent 3 decades measuring fevers and changing dressings, and sitting beside people in the particular silence that comes when the body is struggling and the mind needs company. I have held the hands of people who were frightened, and the hands of people who were past being frightened, and I have learned from all of them that composure is not the absence of feeling. It is the decision to carry feeling without being carried by it. When Vivian said those words to me, those accounts were never really yours, I did not feel nothing. I felt a great deal. I simply did not show her what I felt. Because there is an old saying my mother repeated to me so many times that it became part of the furniture of my mind, as ordinary and as load-bearing as the walls of this house. Still water runs deepest. I thought of it sitting in my chair with my tea in my hands and the incense smoke rising in its patient line above Min's photograph, and I understood, with the particular clarity that only arrives when something long anticipated finally becomes real, that the water in me had been still for a very long time, and it was about to move. Min used to say that a house takes 30 years to become a home. He said it the week we moved in, standing in the empty front room with paint still drying on the walls, and our 2 boys chasing each other down the bare hallway, their feet loud on the concrete floor. He said it the way he said most things, quietly, without looking for agreement, as though he were simply stating something he had already confirmed for himself. I remember laughing at him a little. 30 years seemed like a very long time to wait for a house to feel like anything. I stopped laughing about it sometime in my mid-50s, when I walked into that same front room one evening after a long shift and understood, without thinking about it consciously, that I did not have to look at the walls to know where every mark and shadow fell. The house had become the shape of my body in the dark. Every corner familiar. Every creak of the floor a language I spoke without trying. That is what 30 years does. I was 27 when Min and I moved in. He was 31, already working as a surveyor for the district land office, careful and methodical in everything he did. A man who measured things twice and wrote down the result. I had finished my nursing certification 2 years earlier and had taken a position at the community health station 3 lanes over, close enough that I could walk to work in 12 minutes and be home before the afternoon rain most days. We were not wealthy. We were not struggling. We were the kind of family that managed carefully and saved slowly and took satisfaction in the specific, unglamorous work of building something steady. Min kept records of everything: household expenses in a small green ledger, insurance documents in a labeled binder, property papers in a metal box that lived in the cabinet beneath the window in our bedroom. He was not a suspicious man. He simply believed, as his own father had, that a document unprotected is a document already halfway lost. I used to tease him about the metal box, called it his second wife. He would say, without looking up from whatever he was writing, that his second wife was considerably less trouble than his first. Thomas was born in the 3rd year of our marriage. Daniel came 4 years after that. They were different from the beginning in ways that had nothing to do with how we raised them. Thomas was ambitious and forward-facing, always planning toward the next thing, the way a river moves toward the lowest available point, not from carelessness, but from a kind of natural momentum that doesn't stop to examine itself. Daniel was slower and more deliberate. He became a history teacher, which suited him exactly. He understood that the past is not separate from the present. It is the ground beneath it. I loved both of them in the particular way that mothers love children who are entirely distinct from one another, not the same love divided in 2, but 2 entirely different loves that share nothing except their depth. Min was better at showing it than I was. He was the one who attended every school function, who sat through Daniel's interminable student theater performances with genuine patience, who drove Thomas to engineering exam preparation courses on Saturday mornings and waited in the car with a thermos of tea and a surveying journal. I was present, but quieter about it. My love expressed itself in packed lunches and ironed shirts and the particular vigilance of a nurse who knows which childhood coughs are nothing and which ones deserve attention at 2 in the morning. We had a good life. I want to say that plainly, because I think it matters. The altar came after Min died. He had not been sick long. A stroke, sudden, on a Tuesday afternoon in March. He was at the district office. A colleague found him. By the time I reached the hospital, there was very little left to decide, and the doctors were kind about the way they said so. He was 62 years old. He had never once left a document unsigned, or a bill unpaid, or a shelf in our home, without knowing exactly what was on it. I set up the altar in the front room because the light was best there in the morning. Dark lacquered wood, a frame I chose myself, a photograph from our younger years when his hair was still mostly black, and we were standing outside a building he had helped survey, both of us squinting into the same sun. I refresh the offerings every morning. Tea. A piece of fruit when I have one. A stick of incense. The smoke always goes straight up in still air. On mornings when the window is open, and the lane outside carries a breeze, it bends a little. Leans slightly east. I have watched it for 11 years and I still find it steadying. Not because I believe Min is watching from somewhere behind it, though I do not entirely disbelieve that either, but because the act of it is continuous. It says, I remember, I have not moved on in the way people mean when they say those words. I have simply continued, carrying what I carry, one morning at a time. Thomas brought Vivian to this house for the first time 6 years ago. She stood in the front room and looked at the altar with an expression I could not entirely name, not disrespect, not reverence, something carefully neutral, the expression of a person who is deciding in real time how to position themselves relative to something unfamiliar. She asked about the photograph. I told her. She nodded once and said Min sounded like a very organized man. I said that he was. She moved her gaze from the altar to the rest of the room in a way that I noticed but did not comment on. The particular sweep of it. Taking inventory. I told myself at the time that I was being uncharitable, that she was simply curious about the home her future husband had grown up in, that the look meant nothing more than what it appeared to mean on the surface. I have spent considerable time since then considering whether I was right to give her that benefit of the doubt. The metal box was still in the cabinet beneath the bedroom window, exactly where Min had kept it for 30 years, exactly where I had kept it for 11 years after him. Inside it, among other things, were 3 retirement account statements that Thomas had handed me in a plastic sleeve 3 years earlier, saying only that he and Vivian were between addresses and needed a safe place to store paperwork until they got settled. They had never asked for them back. At the time, I thought nothing of it. I was still thinking nothing of it the evening Vivian left my living room with her folder under her arm and Thomas walking half a step behind her, still not meeting my eyes, and the door closing behind them both with the particular sound of something that has been shut without being resolved. It was only later, much later, after Mrs. Fwang had gone home, and the incense had burned all the way down to ash, and the lane outside had gone quiet, that I got up, walked to the bedroom, and opened the cabinet. The metal box was exactly where it had always been. I did not open it that night. I simply set my hand on the lid and stood there for a moment in the dark, feeling the cool of the metal under my palm, and thought about what Min had said all those years ago about documents and the people who understand their value. Then I went to bed. But I did not sleep for a long time. The notice arrived on a Thursday. Not by hand, not slipped under the door the way neighbors leave things, but through the mail slot in the front gate. Folded inside a plain white envelope with a return address I did not recognize. A legal firm in the city. 3 names on the letterhead, joined by ampersands. I stood at the gate in the morning light, and read it once before I went back inside. It was addressed to Thomas Lamb, care of my address, which was the first thing that told me something was wrong. Because Thomas had not lived at my address in 11 years, and Vivian knew exactly where they had been living for the past decade. If a document needed to reach my son, there was no legitimate reason for it to come to me, unless the person sending it did not want Thomas to receive it at all. I set it on the kitchen table and looked at it while I made my tea. The envelope. The firm name. The careful formality of the address printed on the outside. I had spent 31 years as a nurse, which meant I had spent 31 years learning to read the difference between what a situation presented on its surface and what was actually occurring beneath. A patient who said they felt fine while gripping the bedsheet. A family member who asked calm questions while their eyes moved too quickly around the room. Surface and substance were rarely the same thing, and the gap between them was usually where the truth lived. I did not open the envelope. It was not addressed to me, and I had learned a long time ago that there are moments when the most important thing you can do is wait and watch and let the situation develop without inserting yourself into it prematurely. Patience is not passivity, it is a decision. I called Thomas that evening. He answered on the third ring, which was normal. His voice had the slightly distracted quality it carried when he was at his desk with something else on the screen in front of him. I told him a piece of mail. There was a pause. Brief. Not long enough to be meaningful to someone who wasn't paying attention. But I was paying attention. It's probably just something administrative, he said. From the divorce proceedings. You can leave it, I'll come by and pick it up. He came the following Saturday. I had left the envelope on the kitchen table, exactly where I'd placed it. He picked it up, put it in his jacket pocket without opening it in front of me, and stayed for lunch. We talked about his work, about a project on the north side of the city that was running behind schedule. He ate 2 bowls of rice. He asked about Daniel. He did not mention Vivian. He did not mention the envelope again. I watched him from across the table the way I had watched him as a child, with the particular attention of a mother who knows her son's face in every light and every mood and understands what his eyes are doing even when the rest of him appears entirely composed. His eyes were doing something careful. I let him leave without asking about it, but I took note of the firm name on the envelope before I set it down. 3 names, joined by ampersands. I did not write it down. I did not need to. The names arranged themselves in my memory the way important things do, quietly, without ceremony, settling in as though they intended to stay. 2 weeks later, Mrs. Fuang knocked on my gate just before noon. She had run into Vivian at the market that morning. This was not unusual. The market was 10 minutes from both our houses, and Vivian had continued to shop there even after the divorce proceedings began, which I had always thought was deliberate, a kind of territorial persistence. Mrs. Fuang was a woman of careful observation and few unnecessary words, and she had come to tell me something specific. Vivian had been asking questions. Not about Thomas. About me. About the house. About whether I had mentioned anything recently regarding documents or paperwork. About whether I seemed, in Mrs. Fuang's assessment, confused about financial matters or forgetful about details. Mrs. Fuang delivered this information with the flat, precise affect of someone who wanted me to have the facts without her interpretation of the facts. I thanked her. I poured her tea. After she left, I sat in the front room for a while. The incense on Min's altar had gone out. The afternoon was quiet. Outside the window, a myna bird was doing something noisy in the lychee tree in the yard next door, then abruptly stopped. Vivian had been asking whether I seemed confused. I considered that for a long time. There is a particular kind of move that people make when they are constructing a narrative in advance of needing it. Not a lie, exactly, but a series of quiet suggestions planted in the right places, a word here, a question there, nothing that can be directly challenged because nothing has been directly stated. By the time the narrative is needed, it already exists in pieces in the minds of the people around you. It simply needs to be assembled. I had seen it in hospitals. Family members who arrived with a story about a patient's mental state. A patient who had seemed perfectly clear-headed to every nurse on the ward for 6 weeks. The story was never provable and never disprovable. It was simply there, waiting to be used. That evening I went to the bedroom and opened the metal box. I had been thinking about it for 2 weeks. Since Thomas came and took the envelope. I removed the retirement account statements, 3 of them. In the plastic sleeve Thomas had handed me 3 years earlier. I looked at each one carefully, the way Min would have looked at them, measuring the numbers twice before writing anything down. The figures were clear. Unambiguous. The account balances, the dates, the account numbers. Thomas had been contributing to these accounts since before he met Vivian. Before the marriage. Before the apartment they had moved into together and the new address and the paperwork they had not yet found a safe place to store. I also found, beneath the statements, a beneficiary designation form. I had not thought about this document in years, had not thought about it since Thomas filed it, early in his career, listing me as his beneficiary before he had anyone else to list. He had updated it after the wedding, but the original form was still here, in the box, because Min had kept everything and I had kept everything after Min, and this was simply one of the things that had stayed. I held the form in my hands and thought about Vivian's visit to my living room, the folder. The documents turned toward me on the tea table. Those accounts were never really yours. I thought about the envelope from the law firm, the questions she had been asking at the market about whether I seemed confused. I was not confused. I had never been less confused in my life. I returned the documents to the metal box, closed the lid, and placed it back in the cabinet beneath the bedroom window. Then I sat on the edge of the bed in the darkening room and thought about what Min had kept, and why he had kept it, and what it meant that these particular pieces of paper had survived 11 years of loss and household change, and the slow settling of a life continued alone. I thought about what it would mean to someone like Vivian that they existed, and I thought about the fact that she did not know I had them. That thought, small and quiet as it was, sat in the room with me like a second presence. I did not yet know what I would do with it, but I understood, in the way that a long-practiced stillness sometimes opens onto sudden clarity, that the time for simply watching was beginning to run short. I have always trusted numbers more than words. Words can be shaped. They can be softened or sharpened depending on who is speaking them and what they need the listener to believe. Numbers are less cooperative. A number is what it is, and when it is wrong in a way that does not negotiate. This is something I learned early in my nursing career, long before I learned most of the other things that turned out to matter. A patient's chart said one thing, the patient's body said another. The discrepancy was never the patient's fault. Someone had written something down incorrectly, or chosen a number that was easier to explain than the accurate one, or simply not looked carefully enough at what they were recording. My job, in those moments, was not to argue with the chart. It was to find the gap between what was written and what was true, and to close it before the gap became a problem the patient could not recover from. I thought about that on a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks after I had opened the metal box. I had been thinking about numbers. Specifically, I had been thinking about the figures on the retirement account statements in the plastic sleeve, the dates, the balances, the steady accumulation of contributions that Thomas had made from the year he started working as a civil engineer, fresh out of university, 23 years old and methodical about finances, in the way that children of careful fathers sometimes become. Min had taught him that. The green ledger, the labeled binders, the understanding that money written down is money that exists, and money not written down has a way of disappearing. Thomas had started those retirement contributions 4 years before he met Vivian. 4 years is not a small number. It is 4 years of monthly contributions, compounding, accumulating, becoming a foundation. Under the terms that govern marital assets, those 4 years belonged entirely to Thomas, which meant they belonged to the settlement only in the way that anything from before a marriage belongs to it, which is to say, not at all. I knew this not because I was a lawyer, but because I was a woman who had spent a week reading about QDRO regulations on my phone in the evenings, the way I used to read medical literature when I was a practicing nurse, and needed to understand something that affected my patients. I read slowly and carefully, and I asked myself, after each section, what the information meant in practical terms. What it meant for Thomas. What it meant for the documents in the metal box. On that Tuesday morning, I took the statements out again. I had made a small table on a piece of paper, nothing elaborate. Just 3 columns. The date of each statement. The account balance. The contribution amount for that period. I had been adding to it over the weeks, cross-referencing what I could find in Thomas's employment records, which I did not have directly but which I could partially reconstruct from the statements themselves, since the contribution amounts reflected a percentage of income, and the income could be estimated from there. The numbers told a clear story. The account had begun accumulating 4 years and 3 months before the date on Thomas and Vivian's marriage certificate, which I had attended, and therefore knew precisely. Then I looked at the QDRO document. I did not have the full document. What I had was the summary page that Thomas had shown me briefly during one of his Saturday visits, holding it toward me across the kitchen table, the way people hold documents when they want you to see that something exists without necessarily wanting you to read it carefully. I had read it carefully anyway. I had a memory for figures, always had, and the number on that summary page had settled into my mind, the way important numbers do not by effort but by the quiet insistence of something that does not fit correctly. The figure Vivian's attorney had cited as the marital portion of the retirement account was larger than it should have been. Not dramatically larger. Not a number so wrong that it announced its own wrongness. It was off by the kind of amount that would escape notice in a long document full of other figures, in the way that a slightly crooked picture on a wall goes unnoticed by everyone except the person who hung it straight. The premarital contributions, 4 years and 3 months of them, had not been subtracted. I sat at the kitchen table with my paper and my 3 columns, and looked at the gap between what the statement showed and what the QDRO claimed. $47,420. I wrote the number down. I looked at it for a long time. Then I thought about something else. Something smaller, which is often where the real information lives. Vivian had worked as a hospital billing coordinator for 6 years before she left the position 2 years into the marriage. I had not thought much about her professional background at the time she and Thomas were together, but I was thinking about it now. A hospital billing coordinator works with insurance claims, account numbers, medical codes, and financial documentation every day. They understand how figures move through official paperwork. They understand the difference between what a document states and what the underlying records actually show. They understand, perhaps better than most, how a number can be presented in a way that appears correct while quietly omitting something that would change its meaning entirely. The gap was not an accident. I was as certain of this as I had ever been certain of anything that I could not yet prove. I folded my paper with the 3 columns and placed it in the metal box, on top of the statements, beneath the beneficiary form. Then I closed the lid and returned the box to its place in the cabinet. I spent the rest of that morning doing ordinary things. I watered the plants in the courtyard. I went to the market and bought vegetables and a piece of ginger root and a small bunch of chrysanthemums for Min's altar. I came home and changed the water in the altar vase and lit a fresh stick of incense and stood for a moment in the particular quiet of a room, where the only sound is the small paper crinkle of burning. The smoke went straight up, no wind. A completely still morning. I thought about what Min would have said. He would not have said much. He would have sat at his desk and opened his green ledger and started writing things down, because his answer to uncertainty was always documentation, always the careful building of a record that could stand on its own without anyone needing to explain it. I thought about who else might be able to look at what I had found. Someone who understood QDO documents not as an interested party but as a professional, who could confirm whether what I was reading was what I thought I was reading. I knew one person. A retired accountant who had done our household taxes for 9 years before Min died, and who still sent a card at the Lunar New Year, punctual as a statement. Mr. Heinwin. I had not called him about anything except pleasantries in a long time, but I thought he would answer. I went to find his number. I was standing in the bedroom with my phone in my hand, scrolling through my contacts, when I noticed something. The metal box was in its place in the cabinet, exactly where I had put it 20 minutes earlier, but the cabinet door was not latched the way I always left it. I stood very still and looked at it for a long moment. I lived alone. I had no visitors that morning. The front gate had been locked since I returned from the market. I could not explain why the cabinet door was open, but I had a feeling, slow and cold and entirely precise, that I was not the only one who knew what was inside it. I did not sleep well that night. I lay in the dark and listened to the house settle around me, the way old houses do small compressions, the faint tick of wood cooling after the day's heat, the occasional sound of a motorbike passing on the lane outside. Sounds I had slept through for decades without noticing. That night I noticed all of them. I had checked the gate twice before bed, locked, both times. I had checked the windows in the front room and the kitchen, latched. The cabinet door in the bedroom I had left exactly as I found it, not fully closed, the way I always left it, but sitting at that small angle that was not quite right. I did not touch it. I wanted to remember exactly what I had seen. In the morning I called Mr. Heinwen. He answered on the second ring, which was exactly what I expected. Heinwen had been punctual about everything for as long as I had known him. Taxes filed 3 weeks before the deadline, birthday cards arriving 2 days early, phone calls answered before the third ring as a matter of personal principle. He was 73 now and had been retired for 6 years. But retirement had not changed his fundamental nature any more than it changes the nature of anything that has been doing the same thing for a very long time. I told him I had some documents I would like him to look at, retirement account statements and a summary page from a QDRO filing. I told him I had questions about whether the figures were consistent with each other. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "What time would you like me to come?" He arrived at 10 o'clock the following morning, exactly when he said he would. He wore a pressed gray shirt and carried a reading glasses case in his shirt pocket. I made tea. We sat at the kitchen table. I placed the statements and my handwritten table with the 3 columns in front of him and told him what I had observed. He read without speaking. He took his glasses from the case and put them on. He picked up the statement from the earliest date and held it at a slight angle toward the window light, the way accountants sometimes examine documents, as though the light itself might reveal something. After 15 minutes, he set everything down and looked at me over the top of his glasses. "The premarital contribution period has not been excluded," he said. 4 years and approximately 3 months of contributions are included in the marital asset calculation. At the return rate visible in these statements, the compounded value of that period would be in the range of $46,000 to $48,000. I showed him the figure I had written down, $47,420. He nodded once. "That is consistent with my estimate." I asked him whether this was the kind of error that happened accidentally in a QDRO filing. He was quiet for a moment. He picked up his tea. "In my experience," he said carefully, "a QDRO prepared by a competent attorney includes a specific calculation methodology that identifies the marital start date and excludes all prior contributions. It is a standard step. Omitting it is not a small oversight." He paused. "It is the kind of omission that requires not performing a step that is otherwise routine." I thanked him. I asked if he would be willing to write down what he had just told me. He said he would. He asked for a piece of paper and produced a pen from his shirt pocket and wrote 3 careful paragraphs in the precise, unembellished handwriting of a man who had spent 50 years recording figures that needed to be legible and permanent. He signed and dated it at the bottom. I placed the paper in the metal box. That afternoon, I made a second phone call. This one I had been thinking about for longer, turning it over in my mind the way you turn a difficult thing over, examining it from every angle before committing to it. The person I needed to call was Thomas's lawyer. Not Vivian's lawyer. Thomas's. The man who was supposed to be representing Thomas's interests in the divorce proceedings, and who had, as far as I could tell from the outside, allowed a QDRO to be filed that systematically misrepresented the asset calculation to the disadvantage of his own client. I did not know this man. Thomas had mentioned his name once, in passing a family law attorney he had found through a colleague. I had written the name down at the time without knowing why. I found it in my address book, Attorney Vin Pham. I called his office and left a message with his assistant, saying only that I was Thomas Lamb's mother and that I had documents related to the retirement account portion of the settlement that I believed his office had not seen. He called back within 2 hours. Our conversation was brief. I told him what I had. He was quiet for a moment, in the way professionals are quiet when they are recalibrating something they believed they had already understood. He asked if he could send someone to review the documents. I said I would prefer to bring them to his office myself. We made an appointment for Thursday morning. I was writing the appointment in my calendar when my phone rang again. It was Daniel. He spoke quickly, which was not like him. Daniel was a man of measured sentences and considered pauses, a history teacher's habit of allowing space for information to land before adding more. When he spoke quickly, something had unsettled him. He had been at Thomas's apartment the previous evening. Thomas had shown him something, a document, Daniel said. He was having trouble describing it precisely, something from the divorce proceedings, something about the retirement accounts. I waited. Thomas said Vivian's attorney contacted him last week, Daniel said. They sent him a revised filing, a supplemental declaration. He paused. It names you, M. It lists you as a third-party beneficiary with a potential financial interest in the account. Vivian is arguing that your status as the original beneficiary means you have an existing claim that complicated the asset determination. I set my pen down. She's saying that if Thomas challenges the QDRO, you would need to be named as a co-respondent, Daniel continued. That you would need to retain your own legal representation. That the court would need to examine what financial arrangements existed between you and Thomas regarding the account. I looked at the window. The afternoon light was flat and white. Outside, the lychee tree in the neighbor's yard was perfectly still. Thomas didn't tell me, I said. He was trying to protect you from worrying, Daniel said, but I thought you needed to know. After we hung up, I sat at the kitchen table for a long time. This was the third layer of it, and it was considerably heavier than the first two. The incorrect QDRO figure was a financial manipulation. The questions Vivian had been asking Mrs. Fuang about my mental clarity were a narrative preparation. But this naming me as a co-respondent, threatening to pull me into the legal proceedings as a party rather than a bystander, this was a silencing mechanism. If I became a co-respondent, anything I said, any document I produced, any account I provided of what I knew and when I knew it, could be turned back on me as a financially interested party protecting her own position rather than a witness providing factual information. She was not just taking money that did not belong to her. She was building a wall around anyone who might stop her. I went to the bedroom and opened the metal box. I looked at everything inside it, the statements, Hein Wen's handwritten note, my paper with the 3 columns, the beneficiary designation form, the original document naming me that Thomas had filed before he ever met Vivian, and had since replaced with her name. The form that proved my status as beneficiary had ended years before the marriage, and that I retained no current financial interest in the account whatsoever. The form that made Vivian's supplemental declaration not just wrong but demonstrably, documentably wrong. I closed the box and held it in both hands for a moment. Then I picked up my phone to call attorney Vin Pham back, because Thursday was too far away. What I found when I unlocked the screen stopped me entirely. There was a message from a number I did not recognize. No name. Sent 11 minutes ago, while Daniel and I were on the phone. It said only, "You should be careful about what you think you remember, Mrs. Lamb. Memory is unreliable at your age." I read it 3 times. Then I set the phone face down on the bed, placed both hands flat on the surface beside it, and breathed slowly and deliberately for 30 seconds, the way I had learned to do in 31 years of nursing, when a situation required steadiness before it required anything else. Someone knew I had started asking questions, and they were close enough to know exactly when to send that message. I did not respond to the message. I thought about it carefully, whether responding would reveal more than staying silent, whether silence could be read as confirmation that the message had landed the way it was intended to land. In the end, I decided that silence was the correct choice. Not because I was afraid, but because I had spent 31 years watching people reveal themselves through the responses they could not resist giving, and I had no interest in offering the same gift. I screenshot the message instead, the timestamp, the number. I forwarded it to Daniel with one line, "Save this." Then I called attorney Vin Pham's office and moved our appointment to the following morning. That evening I did something I had not done in years. I went through every drawer in the house, not looking for anything specific, looking for the shape of what I already had. Min had kept records of everything for 30 years, and I had kept records of everything for 11 years after him, and the result was a household that contained more documented history than most small businesses. I moved through the rooms methodically, the way I had once moved through patient wards, steadily, without urgency, noting what was present and what was absent and what required further attention. In the bedroom cabinet, the metal box which I had already examined. In the desk in the back room, which had been Min's desk, and which I had not changed in any significant way since his death, a manila folder containing property documents, insurance certificates, and the original household registration. In the kitchen drawer, 3 years of utility receipts in chronological order, because Min had organized them that way, and I had continued the practice without ever deciding to. In the bottom drawer of the wardrobe, beneath 2 folded blankets that I changed out seasonally, a smaller envelope I had forgotten was there. I sat on the edge of the bed and opened it. Inside were 6 photographs from Thomas's university graduation. He was 22 years old in them, grinning in his academic gown, standing with Min and me in front of the faculty building. In 2 of the photographs he was holding a small framed certificate, his academic achievement award. I remembered the afternoon clearly, the heat, the crowds, the way Min had shaken Thomas's hand with both of his own, which was the most expressive gesture I had ever seen my husband make in public. I set the photographs aside. What I was looking for was not in this envelope. But the act of looking had reminded me of something. Thomas had started his engineering position directly after graduation, the same year as the photographs. I had attended the small celebration his company held for new hires, which had been awkward and pleasant in the way that corporate events for young people always are. I had spoken briefly with the HR director, a woman named Mrs. Cam, who had been warm and professionally competent and who I had not thought about in 15 years. The company had since merged with a larger firm, but employment records did not disappear in a merger. They transferred. I wrote Mrs. Cam's name on my notepad. Below it, I wrote, "Employment start date confirmation, original HR records." I looked at what I had written. There is an old saying my mother used to repeat during the seasons, when our family faced difficulties, not disasters, but the slow accumulating pressures that require endurance rather than action. She would say it quietly, more to herself than to anyone else, in the particular tone of a woman who has already decided that the difficulty will pass because she has seen worse pass before it. Still water runs deepest. The saying had been with me my whole life, but I understood it differently now than I had as a child. As a child, I had taken it to mean patience, the simple instruction to wait. Sitting in Min's back room with my notepad and my careful list of what I had and what I still needed, I understood it as something more precise. Still, water does not only endure, it finds its level. It moves through the smallest available opening. It reaches where it is going not through force but through the persistent, unhurried intelligence of water that knows its own weight. I had been still for a long time. I was beginning to understand where I needed to go. Attorney Vin Pham's office was on the 4th floor of a building near the courthouse, a clean and functional space that smelled of air conditioning and paper. He was younger than I had expected, early 40s, with the careful, slightly tired manner of a family law attorney who has heard a great many versions of the same story, and is always looking for the one that contains something genuinely new. I placed the retirement account statements on his desk. I placed Hai Nguyen's handwritten assessment beside them. I placed my own 3-column table last, without explanation, and let him read. He read for 11 minutes. I know because I watched the clock on his wall. When he looked up, the tired quality in his expression had changed into something more attentive. "Where did you get the original statements?" he asked. I told him Thomas had given them to me for safekeeping when he and Vivian had moved apartments. That I had kept them in a box with other household documents without particular intention. Pham looked at the statements again. "The calculation in the QDRO excludes the marital start date adjustment entirely," he said. I submitted my review based on the figures their attorney provided during the preliminary filing. I did not have access to these. He said this without defensiveness, which I appreciated. He was stating a fact, not protecting himself. "Their attorney provided the figures," I said. "Yes." "Without the original statements for comparison?" "Yes." A pause. "Mrs. Lam, if these statements are authenticated, the marital portion of the account was overstated by a significant amount. The entire QDRO would need to be reviewed." I told him about Mrs. Cam and the employment records. I told him what I needed confirmation of Thomas's original start date from HR, documented and signed, so that the 4-year premarital contribution period could be established independently of the statements alone. He wrote it down. He said he would file a motion to reopen the asset review and request the original employment records simultaneously. I asked him about the supplemental declaration naming me as a co-respondent. He was quiet for a moment. "It is an unusual move," he said carefully. "The beneficiary designation was updated before the marriage. Your current status creates no financial interest in the account." Another pause. "It reads as an attempt to complicate the proceedings for anyone who might otherwise provide supporting documentation." "I know," I said. I left his office with an appointment for the following week, and a specific feeling that I had not had since the morning Vivian walked into my living room with her folder. Not satisfaction, not yet. Something quieter, the particular steadiness that comes when you have placed the first load-bearing piece of a structure correctly and feel it settle into position. On my way home, I stopped at the market. Not for anything I needed. I simply walked through it the way I had walked through it every week for 40 years, past the vegetable stalls and the dried goods, and the woman who sold the best ginger in the district and had been selling it from the same spot since before my boys were born. Mrs. Fwang was there, at the far end near the fruit section. We did not approach each other. We simply made brief eye contact across the crowd, the way neighbors do when they share an understanding that does not require words. She gave me a small nod. I continued to the ginger stall. That evening, going through my phone, I found something I had not noticed during the previous day's distraction. The unknown number that had sent the message about my unreliable memory. I had forwarded it to Daniel, but I had not yet examined it carefully myself. I looked at it now. The number had a prefix I did not recognize as local. I typed it into the search function on my phone. The result that came back was not a name. It was a business listing. Graves & Associates, a consulting firm. The registered address was the same building as the law offices of attorney Raymond Chow. I set my phone down on the kitchen table and looked at it for a long moment. Vivian's attorney had not simply filed a legal document naming me as a co-respondent. He had sent the message himself. The motion arrived on a Monday, not through Vin Pham's office, which would have been the appropriate channel, directly to my address, by courier, in a sealed envelope with the return stamp of Chow and Associates pressed into the upper left corner like a declaration. I signed for it at the gate. The courier did not meet my eyes. He handed me the envelope and left before I had taken 3 steps back toward the house. I set it on the kitchen table and made tea before opening it. The document was 12 pages. Formal court letterhead at the top, the case number, the names of both parties. I read it from the first page to the last without stopping, the way I had learned to read patient files completely, in sequence, without jumping ahead to the conclusion before understanding how the conclusion had been constructed. By page 4, I understood what it was. By page 8, I understood what it was intended to do. The filing was a motion for summary determination of the QDRO as originally submitted. Vivian's attorney was asking the court to finalize the retirement account division without further review, citing what he described as the deliberate interference of a third party in settled proceedings. The third party named was me. The language was careful and precise in the way that damaging language always is when it has been written by someone who knows exactly what they are doing. It did not call me dishonest. It said that documents had been introduced to the proceedings through an indirect channel by a party with an undisclosed financial interest. It did not say I had fabricated anything. It said the provenance of the documents I had provided to Thomas's attorney was irregular and required examination before any asset recalculation could proceed. It said, in the measured vocabulary of legal filings, that an elderly woman's recollections about documents she claimed to have stored for years were an insufficient basis for reopening a settled matter. Elderly woman's recollections. I read that phrase twice. Then I set the document down and drank my tea and looked out the kitchen window at the courtyard, where the small potted gardenia on the left side of the step had put out 3 new buds since the morning. I was not surprised. I want to be clear about that. I had understood since the anonymous message about my unreliable memory that this was the shape of what was coming, the slow, methodical construction of a picture in which I was not a witness but a problem. An old woman who could not be trusted to remember things correctly. A sentimental mother interfering in legal proceedings she did not understand. A third party whose involvement complicated rather than clarified. What surprised me was the timing. Pham had filed his motion to reopen the asset review only 4 days ago. Chow had responded in 4 days with a 12-page counterfiling. That kind of response is not written in 4 days. It is written in advance, by someone who anticipated the move and had the answer prepared before the question was formally asked, which meant Vivian had known I was going to Pham's office before I went. I thought about that for a long time. The only people who had known about my appointment were Pham himself, his assistant, Daniel, and me. I had not told Thomas directly, because I did not yet know how much Thomas understood about what was being done in his name, and I had not wanted to put him in a position of divided loyalty before I had something concrete to show him. I called Daniel. He answered immediately. I told him about the filing. He was quiet in the way he became quiet when something had genuinely alarmed him, not the considered pause of a man thinking, but the brief arrested silence of a man absorbing something he had not expected. Did you tell anyone about my appointment with Fam? I asked. Another silence. Longer. Thomas called me the day after you and I spoke, he said. He asked me what was happening. I told him you were getting some documents reviewed. I didn't tell him where. Did you tell him when? A pause. I may have mentioned it was soon. I said nothing. I'm sorry, Daniel said. He said it simply, without elaboration, which was the right way to say it. I told him it was all right, and that I would call him later, and I ended the call. I was not angry at Daniel. He had told his brother a small thing, and Thomas had told his wife a smaller thing, or perhaps said nothing at all, and she had understood from his expression that something was in motion. After 11 years of marriage and 3 years of divorce proceedings, Vivian understood Thomas the way a navigator understands a shoreline: every inlet, every shallow place, every current that looked calm on the surface and was not. That afternoon she came to my house. I heard the gate, before I heard her voice, the particular sound of someone opening it with confidence, without hesitation, which is a different sound from the way neighbors arrive. I was in the back room and I came to the front room doorway before she reached the door. She looked well. That was the first thing I noticed, the deliberate, unhurried, well-put-togetherness of a woman who had taken care with her appearance before coming here. Dark trousers, a light blouse, the same pale, composed expression she had worn the first time she sat in this room, though there was something different underneath it today, something that had the temperature of certainty rather than strategy. She thought she had already won. Thomas was not with her. She had come alone, which told me something. She did not ask to sit down. She stood in the middle of my front room, between the door and the altar, and she looked at me with the expression of someone delivering a conclusion rather than beginning a conversation. I wanted to come personally, she said, because I think it's better when these things are handled directly. I waited. The motion we filed this morning brings this to a close, she said. The court will finalize the QDRO as submitted. Whatever documentation you believe you have will need to be submitted through proper channels, and given your status in the proceedings, the court will give it the weight that is appropriate. A brief pause. Calibrated. Which is to say, very little. She looked around the room when she said this, not rudely. Just the particular sweep of her gaze that I had noticed the first time she stood here, 6 years ago. Taking inventory of a space, she was deciding whether to bother understanding. Her eyes moved to the altar, Min's photograph. The fresh chrysanthemums I had placed that morning, the incense burned to a short stub, the cup of tea I had refreshed at dawn. You've kept this up all these years, she said. It was not a question. Yes, I said. She looked at it for a moment longer than necessary. Then she looked back at me. He was a careful man, from what Thomas says. Very organized. Kept records of everything, a pause with a specific texture to it, admiring the surface of something while pressing against it. I suppose that's where Thomas got it from. I said nothing. The problem, Vivian continued, her voice settling into the smooth register of a person reaching the point they have been building toward, is that being careful and being correct are not the same thing. A careful person can keep the wrong documents for 30 years and believe sincerely that they are relevant. She met my eyes. That is not dishonesty. That is simply the limitation of what any one person can reliably know. She was telling me, with complete composure, in my own living room, in front of my husband's altar, that my memory was not to be trusted and my documents were not reliable, and the court would agree with her on both points. She was telling me this with the specific confidence of someone who believes the other person has nowhere left to go. I understand, I said. The same 2 words I had said the first time she came here. Something moved in her expression. Briefer this time. She had expected something different: argument, distress, the visible defeat of a woman who had run out of options. What she received instead was a stillness she could not read. She said goodbye. She left through the gate the same way she had entered, confidently, without hesitation, the sound of someone who has finished a task and moved on to the next one. I stood in the front room after she left and listened to the gate close. Then I walked to the altar. I looked at Min's photograph for a long moment, the pressed shirt he'd worn that day, the slight squint against the sun, the expression of a man standing outside a building he had helped survey and feeling, simply and completely, that the work had been done correctly. I picked up my phone and called Fam. He answered on the first ring. I told him about the filing. He was quiet for 3 seconds, which was longer than his usual pause. They moved faster than I expected, he said. Then, before I could respond, but Mrs. Lamb, there is something you should know. The employment records came back this afternoon. I waited. Thomas's start date is confirmed, he said. 4 years and 4 months before the marriage certificate, signed by the current HR director and accompanied by the original onboarding documentation. I closed my eyes for a moment. And there is something else in the records, Pham said carefully. Something I was not expecting to find. Pham's office was very quiet when I arrived. His assistant showed me in without the usual pleasantries, which told me something. The woman had a warm and efficient manner on both my previous visits, a brief smile, an offer of water, the practiced ease of someone who managed difficult appointments by making the approach to them feel ordinary. This time she simply opened the door and stepped aside. Pham was standing when I entered. Not behind his desk. At the window, with his back to the room, looking out at the street below. He turned when he heard me and gestured to the chair across from his desk, and I sat down, and he sat down, and he placed a folder on the desk between us without opening it. He looked at me for a moment before he spoke. The employment records confirmed Thomas's start date, he said. 4 years and 4 months before the marriage. That portion of the case is solid. I nodded. I waited. What I did not expect, he continued, was what else was in the records. He opened the folder. He turned it toward me. The HR documentation includes a standard onboarding packet, benefits elections, tax forms, direct deposit setup, and a beneficiary designation form from the retirement account, completed on Thomas's first day of employment. I looked at the form. It was a photocopy, clean and legible. Thomas's handwriting, young and slightly less settled than it became later. His name, his employee number, the account details. In the beneficiary field, a name. Not my name. Not Vivian's name, which would have been impossible since they had not yet met. The name in the beneficiary field was Vivian Hoang. I read it twice. Then I set it down on the desk and looked at the window behind Pham's head and breathed carefully for a moment. That's not possible, I said. My voice was level. I was working to keep it level. The form is dated his first day of employment, Pham said, 17 years ago. A pause. Vivian Hong did not become Vivian Lam until 13 years ago. She and Thomas were not acquainted at the time this form would have been completed. I looked at the form again. The date, the handwriting, the beneficiary field. Someone altered it, I said. The forensic review will confirm that, Pham said. But yes. That is what I believe we are looking at. He was quiet for a moment. If this form enters the proceedings as submitted as a document predating the marriage that establishes Vivian as a long-term designated beneficiary, it substantially changes the legal landscape of the asset division. It would suggest a financial relationship that predates the marriage, which affects how the retirement account is classified entirely. I understood what he was saying. If that document was accepted as genuine, the retirement account would no longer be framed as marital property divided at dissolution. It would be framed as an asset in which Vivian had a designated interest from the very beginning, older than the marriage. Independent of it. Immune to the arguments about premarital contribution periods. The $47,000 would be the smallest part of what she was claiming. I sat with that understanding for a long moment. Outside Pham's window, the city went about its afternoon. A motorbike, a delivery truck at the curb. The ordinary sounds of a world that did not know what was being said in this quiet fourth-floor room. Thomas didn't know, I said. It was not a question. I don't believe so, Pham said carefully. In my assessment, he was presented with the QDRO figures and trusted that the calculation was correct. He didn't have the original statements for comparison. He had no reason to examine the onboarding documentation. A pause. He trusted the process. Thomas had trusted the process because he trusted Vivian, or had trusted her once, or had trusted the version of her that he had believed existed. And she had understood his trust, the way a builder understands a load-bearing wall, not as something to honor but as something to use. I thought about Thomas at 12 years old, sitting at the kitchen table with Min's green ledger open in front of him, learning how to record expenses in the careful columns his father had maintained for decades. I thought about Thomas at 23, sitting across from an HR coordinator on his first day of employment, filling out forms with the focused earnestness of a young man beginning something he intended to do correctly. Someone had taken that form, had taken his first day handwriting, his young signature, and had inserted a name that had not been there. Had built, from the raw material of his careful beginning, a document that turned everything he had worked for into something she could claim. I picked up the photocopy and looked at it one more time. The handwriting in the beneficiary field was not Thomas's. I could see that now, looking carefully. Close enough to be plausible at a glance. The same slight leftward slant, the same size. Someone had studied his handwriting, had practiced it, perhaps, or had found a way to approximate it well enough that a routine review would not flag it. But I had read Thomas's handwriting for 23 years. I had read the notes he left on the kitchen counter when he came home late and did not want to wake me. I had read his school compositions and his engineering reports, and the birthday cards he sent every year without fail. A habit Min had installed in him so early it had become permanent. I knew his handwriting the way I knew his voice. The name Vivian Hong had not been written by my son. What happens now? I said. Pham folded his hands on the desk. I am requesting an independent forensic examination of both documents, the altered QDRO and this onboarding form. I am also filing an urgent motion to stay the summary determination Chow submitted this morning, pending evidence review. He paused. The stay motion will be challenged. Chow will argue there is no basis for delay. The judge will need to decide whether to grant it. How long do we have? The summary determination is scheduled to be reviewed in 11 days. He met my eyes. If the stay is not granted, the QDRO finalizes as submitted. Everything after that becomes substantially more difficult. 11 days. I drove home in the late afternoon light, through traffic that moved slowly, and then stopped and then moved again in the patient, indifferent way of city traffic that has no awareness of urgency. I sat in it, and did not think about the documents. I thought about Thomas. I thought about the specific moment I needed to tell him what I had found. I had been protecting him from the full picture, the way mothers protect children from things they are not yet ready to hold. But Thomas was 41 years old, and this was his life and his money and his name on every form that had been altered. He had a right to know. More than that, he needed to know, because what came next would require him to act, and he could not act correctly on a picture that was incomplete. I parked in the lane outside the house and sat in the car for a moment. The light was going golden in the way it does in the late afternoon. That particular low horizontal light that makes even ordinary things look briefly significant. The front gate. The potted gardenia on the step. The roof tiles that needed attention on the left side, a task I had been deferring for 2 years. I thought about Min's green ledger, his labeled binders, the metal box in the cabinet beneath the bedroom window. His conviction that a document unprotected is a document already halfway lost. I thought about Thomas on his first day of employment, sitting across from an HR coordinator, filling out his onboarding forms with careful, earnest handwriting. I thought about what someone had done to that handwriting, to that form, to the beginning of everything he had tried to build honestly. I went inside. I lit a stick of incense at the altar. I stood in front of Min's photograph for a long time, the smoke rising straight up in the still air of the front room, unhurried, patient, carrying whatever it carried toward whatever received it. Then I picked up my phone and called my son. He answered on the second ring. Thomas, I said, I need you to come here tonight. I need to show you something, and I need you to see all of it. A pause. The careful pause of a man who has been managing a difficult situation for months and has learned to listen for what is underneath what is being said. How serious is it? He asked. I looked at Min's photograph. The pressed shirt, the slight squint, the expression of a man standing outside a building he had helped make correctly. Serious enough, I said, that you should come alone. The mediation room on the 4th floor of the Dallas County Civil Courts building was smaller than I had expected. I want to correct myself. We were not in Dallas. We were in a civil mediation office 3 blocks from the family court, in a room that had the same quality as all such rooms anywhere in the world, the long table, the fluorescent light that flattened everything it touched, the particular atmosphere of a space designed to make people feel that resolution is both necessary and possible. The mediator, a woman named Mrs. Than Bui, appointed by the court, sat at the head of the table with a notepad and the unhurried manner of someone who has overseen a great many rooms like this one and knows that the truth surfaces eventually if you give it enough space. Vivian sat across from me. She wore dark charcoal today. Precise, composed, her folder on the table in front of her, the way it had been on my tea table 3 months ago. Attorney Raymond Chow sat to her left, one hand resting on his own portfolio, his expression the careful neutral of a professional who has learned to project confidence even when the ground has shifted. He did not know yet how much it had shifted. That was evident from the way he arranged his documents, settled, unhurried, a man who believed he was walking into a formality. Pham sat to my right. He had said very little since we arrived. That was how I had come to understand him, his silence, before a proceeding was not vacancy but preparation, a gathering of the precise moment to place each piece where it needed to go. Thomas sat 2 seats down from Pham. He had not looked at Vivian since we entered the room. Daniel was there as well, in the chair against the wall behind me, not a party to the proceedings, but present as what Pham had formally requested, a corroborating witness to documents reviewed. Mrs. Phuong had come as far as the lobby downstairs and was waiting there. She had offered without being asked, appearing at my gate that morning in her good blouse, saying only that she would like to be nearby in case she was needed. I had thanked her and said the lobby was sufficient. Mrs. Bui opened the session. She reviewed the purpose of the mediation to examine the evidentiary dispute before the scheduled summary determination and to determine whether the court's review required extension. She noted the filings from both parties. She noted the pending stay motion. She asked whether both sides were prepared to present. Chow said yes with the particular smoothness of a man who has said yes in rooms like this many times. Pham said yes and opened his folder. What followed was methodical, not dramatic, not in the way that things are dramatic in films or in stories where the truth arrives with music and motion. It arrived the way truth usually arrives in official rooms, one document at a time, placed on the table, read, noted, followed by the next. Pham presented the retirement account statements first. He walked through the dates, the contribution figures, the calculation that Hein Nguyen had assessed in writing. He presented Hein Nguyen's signed statement. He presented the employment start date confirmation from HR, signed by the current director, accompanied by the original onboarding packet. Chow objected twice during this portion. Mrs. Bui noted both objections and continued. Then Pham placed the onboarding beneficiary designation form on the table. The photocopy first. Then the forensic examiner's report, which had arrived 2 days earlier with the particular precise language of a professional who measures everything and qualifies nothing. The report stated that the handwriting in the beneficiary field was inconsistent with the authenticated samples of Thomas Lamb's handwriting provided for comparison. The ink composition in that field was inconsistent with the ink used elsewhere on the same form, suggesting the field had been completed at a different time and with a different instrument. The date on the form predated any documented connection between Thomas Lamb and Vivian Hong by 4 years. The room was very quiet. I watched Chow's face during the reading of the forensic report. The careful neutral held for the first 2 paragraphs. By the 3rd paragraph, it had become something more effortful, the expression of a man who is deciding, in real time, how much he knew and how much he can credibly claim not to have known. It is a specific calculation, and it has a specific look. I had seen it before, in hospital corridors, in the faces of people who understood that a situation had developed beyond what their previous position could accommodate. Mrs. Bui set the forensic report down and looked at Vivian. Vivian's composure was intact. I will say that for her. It held the way expensive things hold under initial pressure completely, showing nothing, giving the impression that what is beneath it is equally solid. She looked at Mrs. Bui and then at the documents on the table and then at Chow, and whatever passed between them in that look contained an entire conversation that no one else in the room was meant to hear. Chow requested an adjournment. Pham responded that the forensic report had been filed with the court 2 days prior and that both parties had received it through proper channels within the same window. Mrs. Bui noted this. She did not grant the adjournment. Then Pham placed one more document on the table. It was a single page. A sworn statement from a woman named Linda Phuoc, who had been Vivian's college roommate for 2 years, and who had, through the indirect line I had set in motion 9 days earlier, agreed to provide a written account of a specific conversation. In that conversation, which had taken place 15 years ago, Vivian had described meeting a civil engineer whose family owned a construction company and outlined, in terms that Linda Fouque had found striking enough to remember, what it would mean financially to establish a claim that predated a marriage rather than being limited by it. Linda Fouque had not known, at the time, whether the conversation was planning or speculation. She knew now. The statement was 3 paragraphs. It was not lengthy. It did not need to be. I watched Vivian read it. She read it the way she had read everything in that room, carefully, without visible reaction, her eyes moving across the lines with the controlled attention of someone who has disciplined herself against visible response. But there was a moment, brief as the moment in my living room when she had looked at Min's altar and taken inventory, when something shifted behind her composure, something that was not panic and not remorse, but something quieter and more permanent. The look of a structure registering a load it was not built to carry. It lasted 2 seconds. Then she set the statement down and folded her hands on the table and looked at Mrs. Bowie. Mrs. Bowie was looking at the documents. I thought about what Vivian had said to me in my living room 3 months ago, standing between the door and my husband's altar, looking at me with the specific confidence of someone who believes the other person has run out of options. Those accounts were never really yours, Mrs. Lamb. You just held them for my husband while he worked, the court agreed. I thought about that sentence, about the precision of it. The way it had been constructed to land in a particular place, not just on my understanding of the finances, but on my sense of my own position, what I was entitled to know, what I was capable of understanding. Whether a retired community health nurse in her late 60s, living alone in an old house with an altar and a metal box, was a person whose memory and judgment and careful keeping of documents over 30 years amounted to anything that a courtroom would take seriously. She had answered her own question this morning without meaning to. She had told me those accounts were never really mine, and I had placed on this table, one document at a time, the complete record of what was actually true, the statements Thomas had handed me for safekeeping, the accountant's assessment, the employment confirmation, the forensic report, the sworn statement from a woman who had heard the plan described before the marriage existed. Every piece of it from documents that had survived because someone in my household had believed, for 30 years, that a document unprotected is a document already halfway lost. Mrs. Bowie set down her pen and looked at both sides of the table. I am recommending an immediate stay of the summary determination, she said, pending full judicial review of the evidentiary record. She paused. I am also recommending that the court request a separate examination of the circumstances under which the onboarding document entered the proceedings. Chow said something in a low voice to Vivian. Vivian did not respond to him. She was looking at the documents on the table in front of her, and her hands, which had been folded so carefully since she sat down, had separated. She had placed them flat on the table, apart from each other, the way a person places their hands when they are no longer performing composure and have not yet decided what comes next. Thomas, 2 seats down from Pham, let out a breath that was very quiet and very long. I picked up my cup of water and drank from it. Set it down. Outside the window of the mediation room, the afternoon was going about its business traffic, voices, the particular ambient sound of a city that proceeds without pausing for the things that happen in small 4th-floor rooms. Inside the room, the only sound was the rustle of documents being gathered, and the chair of Raymond Chow, attorney at law, scraping back from the table as he stood and reached for his portfolio with hands that were, for the first time since I had seen him, not entirely steady. The stay was granted on a Friday morning. Pham called me at 8:15 to tell me. His voice had the quality it carried when something had gone precisely as he had calculated. Not surprised, not triumphant, simply confirmed. The summary determination was suspended. The court had scheduled a formal evidentiary hearing for 3 weeks out. In the interim, the QDRO, as submitted by Chow and Associates, was unenforceable. I thanked him. I hung up. I went to the altar and changed the water in the vase and lit a fresh stick of incense and stood quietly for a moment. Then, I sat down at the kitchen table and waited to see what came next. What came next arrived not through legal channels but through Daniel, who called me 4 days after the stay was granted with the particular tone of a man delivering information that is simultaneously surprising and, in retrospect, entirely predictable. Chow and associates had withdrawn from the case. Not quietly, not through a routine notice of withdrawal. Chow had filed the withdrawal on the same day that the Vietnam Bar Association's Professional Conduct Committee confirmed receipt of a formal complaint against him, a complaint filed not by Pham, not by Thomas, but by Vivian herself. I sat with that for a moment. Daniel explained what he had learned from Thomas, who had heard it from Vivian's new attorney, a straightforward family law practitioner named Mrs. Dow, who had taken the case on short notice and had spent her first week reviewing everything Chow had submitted. Mrs. Dow had then gone back to Vivian with a specific question. Had Vivian known, at the time the onboarding form entered the proceedings, that the beneficiary field had been altered? Vivian had said she had not known. She had said that Chow had obtained the document and represented it to her as a legitimate discovery from Thomas's employment records. That she had reviewed it and believed it was genuine because Chow had told her it was genuine. That she had not possessed the forensic knowledge to identify the inconsistencies in the handwriting or the ink composition, and that she had trusted her attorney's representation of the document's authenticity. Whether this was true, I could not say with certainty, but I knew the shape of it. I had seen it before, in hospitals, in the careful restructuring of a narrative that occurs when a situation has developed beyond what the original story can accommodate. The question is never only what happened. It is also who carries the weight of it when the structure fails. Chow had obtained the document. Chow had represented it as legitimate. Chow had submitted it to the court. And Chow, it now appeared, had done so while his client maintained that she had been deceived. Whether a court would accept that account was a separate question. What was not a separate question was what the Professional Conduct Committee would find when they examined the submission record, the timestamps on the document, and the communication trail between Chow's office and Vivian over the months preceding the filing. That examination was underway. It would take time, but it had begun. Thomas came to dinner the following Sunday. He arrived on time, which he always did, and he brought a bag of fruit from the market, which he had not done in some months. A small gesture, the kind that does not announce itself. We sat at the kitchen table and ate and talked about his work. The North Side project was progressing. A new contract had come through for a commercial building in the Eastern District. The company he worked for had promoted him to senior project manager in February, which he had mentioned in passing at the time, and which I had noted without comment, because he had mentioned it in the tone of someone who was carrying too many other things to receive good news correctly. Tonight he mentioned it again, differently. With the tone of a man who was beginning to set things down. He did not talk about Vivian directly. He talked around the perimeter of it, the paperwork, the timeline, what Pham expected the hearing to establish, what the revised asset calculation would likely look like once the premarital contribution period was correctly excluded. Practical things. Engineer things. The language of a man who processes difficulty by converting it into a sequence of solvable problems. I let him talk. I refilled his rice without asking. I had learned, in 40 years of sitting at tables with people who were working through something large, that the most useful thing you can do is provide continuity. Food, tea, the unchanged presence of a room that knows them. Near the end of the evening, he was quiet for a while. The good quiet. Not the heavy kind. Then he said, "You kept those statements for 3 years. I said that I had. You didn't know you'd need them." "No," I said. "I just kept them because your father always kept things. It was a habit more than a decision." He looked at the altar. Min's photograph. The incense holder, empty now. The evening stick, long finished. He would have known, Thomas said, that they'd matter eventually. I thought about Min at his desk with his green ledger, recording figures that no one had asked him to record, organizing documents that no emergency had yet required, building the habit of preservation into every year of his life, because he understood that the future is not a thing you can see, but it is a thing you can prepare for. "Yes," I said. He would have known. Thomas left at 9. At the gate, he paused, his hand on the latch, and turned back. "I'm sorry," he said. "For not telling you sooner what was happening. For thinking I was protecting you." I looked at my son in the lane light, 41 years old, the jaw that was his father's and the eyes that were his own, a man who had been built from careful things and had found his way back to them. "You protected what you thought needed protecting at the time," I said. That's not something to apologize for." He nodded once. He left. The following week, the Professional Conduct Committee issued a preliminary finding. Fam forwarded it to me with a brief note, as expected. The finding documented a pattern of conduct in Chow's filing history, 3 prior cases in which documents of uncertain provenance had been submitted under circumstances that the committee described as requiring further examination. The onboarding form was the 4th. The committee had referred the matter to the disciplinary board for a formal hearing. Chow had responded through his own legal representation. He was, apparently, now in the position of requiring legal representation. The anonymous message about my unreliable memory, the one sent from the number registered to Chow's affiliated consulting firm, while I was on the phone with Daniel, had been included in the evidentiary file. Fam had flagged it in his submission as evidence of coordinated conduct. The committee had noted it. That message, sent to an elderly woman to tell her that her memory could not be trusted, had become part of the official record of Raymond Chow's professional conduct. I found something specifically satisfying about that. Not triumph. I want to be precise about this, the same way I wanted to be precise when I sat in my front room 3 months ago and heard Vivian tell me that those accounts had never been mine. What I felt then was not humiliation, though it was designed to produce humiliation. And what I felt now was not triumph, though it could be described that way from the outside. What I felt was the particular satisfaction of a structure that has been tested and has held. Fam scheduled a call for the following morning to review the hearing preparation. Thomas had his own appointment with Fam the day after that, for the formal declaration about the onboarding form. Daniel had already provided his corroborating witness statement. Hein Nguyen's assessment was in the file. Linda Phuoc's sworn statement was in the file. The employment records were in the file. Every piece was in place. What remained was the hearing itself, and the hearing was 3 weeks away, and I had learned in 31 years of nursing that the work you do in the quiet time before the critical moment is what determines the outcome of the critical moment. I had done the work. So had Fam. So had Thomas, in his own way, in the simple act of finally seeing clearly what had been built around him and deciding that clarity was worth more than the comfort of continued uncertainty. I sat at the kitchen table that evening, after Thomas had gone and after Daniel had called to check in, and after Fam's message had been read and filed and the day had finished itself in the ordinary way that days do regardless of what they contain. I looked at the metal box where it sat on the table in front of me. I had taken it out of the cabinet that morning, the same morning the stay was granted, without entirely knowing why. It had sat on the kitchen table all day. The same box Min had bought 30 years ago for documents that might matter. The same box I had opened on the night Vivian first came to my living room, setting my hand on the cool lid and standing in the dark without opening it. Now I opened it. The statements, Hein Nguyen's letter, my 3-column table, the beneficiary designation form, the original one, Thomas's actual handwriting in every field, my name where it had once belonged and then been correctly replaced, and beneath all of it, at the very bottom of the box, something I had not consciously placed there but which had settled there the way important things settle a photograph. Thomas at his university graduation. 22 years old. Grinning, his father's hand on his shoulder, the beginning of everything. I looked at it for a long time. Then I placed it back at the bottom of the box and closed the lid. Tomorrow there was still work to do. But tonight, in the quiet of the front room with the incense finished and the lane outside gone still and Min looking out from his frame with the expression of a man who had built things carefully and trusted them to hold, it was enough to sit here and understand that what had been kept safe was still safe. And that the hearing, when it came, would simply be the moment the world confirmed what was already true. The civil judgment was entered on a Thursday morning in early December. I was not in the courtroom when it happened. David Park had told me I did not need to be present for the final filing. The contested portion was long finished. The evidence had been submitted. The judge had reviewed everything Miss Bui had prepared and everything Arthur had testified to, and everything Carolyn had confirmed when she carried the sealed envelope to the witness stand and opened it in front of the room and placed the promissory note flat on the surface, where it could be seen clearly by everyone who needed to see it. I was at home when David called. I was in the kitchen, making tea, the ordinary morning kind with no ceremony to it, just water and heat and the small ritual of a cup. "It's done," he said. "Full judgment in your favor. The promissory note is enforced as written. All fraudulent instruments are voided. The legal hold on your account is lifted. The court has ordered full restitution of the stolen funds plus the costs of the forensic investigation. I thanked him. I finished making my tea. The criminal proceedings moved more slowly, as criminal proceedings do. That process belonged to other people now, investigators, prosecutors, the machinery of consequence that moves at its own pace and does not require my presence to operate. Daniel and Vivian had retained separate attorneys, as Vivian had requested in David's conference room on the morning the scene came apart. I did not follow the details closely. That was not my part of this story anymore. My part was the house on Phong Dinh Phung Street, and the altar in the front room, and the morning light that fell honestly across Min's photograph at a particular angle that had not changed in 32 years. I changed the water in the ceramic cup. I lit one stick of incense, and watched the smoke rise straight and thin into the still air of the room. I thought about what I had, and what I had recovered, and what the difference was between those two things. The money mattered not because I needed luxury, but because it had been earned across a lifetime of 40-minute lessons and Sunday evenings at the kitchen table and 35 years of standing in front of students who needed someone to believe that their words mattered. That money was not abstract. It was time. It was the hours of a life given in a particular direction, stored carefully, meant for something. It was not meant to buy a diamond tennis bracelet for a woman I had met twice. But what I had recovered was not only money. I had recovered the house. The developer inquiry had been withdrawn once the power of attorney was voided. The dark green shutters Min had approved remained on their hinges. The window in the back bedroom stayed slightly open on rainy nights, as it always had. The altar stood in the front room where the light was honest, the way Min's mother had taught me it should stand. I had recovered the promissory note not as a piece of paper, but as proof of what I had already known. That I was not soft. That I was not confused. That the trust I had extended to my son had been real and deliberate and documented by a woman who had spent 35 years teaching the difference between words that were meant and words that were not. 2 weeks after the judgment, Carolyn came for dinner. She brought food, too much of it, the way she always does, 3 containers stacked in a bag. Enough for 4 people when there were only 2 of us. We ate at the kitchen table with the fan going and the evening sounds coming through the open window, and we talked about things that had nothing to do with courts or forensic accountants or mediation sessions in 4th-floor conference rooms. We talked about a film she had seen, about a student we had both taught in different years, who had become a journalist and written something worth reading, about the jasmine on the windowsill, which had bloomed again. Arthur Ngo came by on a Sunday morning, in his white shirt with the small collar, and sat in his usual chair and drank his tea and said very little, which was exactly what was needed. When he left, he paused at the door, the way he always did when he was about to say something he considered worth saying. "Miriam," he said, "you handled this the way Min would have wanted." I thought about that for a long time after he left. Min had been a precise man, an engineering professor who understood that structures hold because of what is built into them, not what is added on top. He had chosen a house for its bones. He had chosen a life for the same reason, built carefully, load-bearing in the right places, designed to hold weight without collapsing. He had chosen me. I sat in front of his photograph that evening, as the light shifted from afternoon to dusk, the way it does in December, earlier than you expect, the day folding quietly into itself. The incense had burned to ash. The ceramic cup held fresh water. His face in the photograph was the face of the anniversary year, the year he had laughed easily in Dalat, before the illness, before the open window and the steady breathing, and the ordinary last question about the stove. I thought about Daniel. Not with anger, the anger had done its work, and I had let it go the way you let a season go when it has finished. I thought about him the way you think about a building that did not hold. Not with hatred for the building, but with a clear understanding of where the weakness was, and what it had cost. I thought about what I would leave behind. Not to him. That had been answered by a judge in a courtroom on a Thursday morning in December, answered as clearly and permanently as anything I had ever written in my own handwriting. I thought about the notebook. The dark blue one with the hard cover, the one I had bought at the stationery shop on Dong Khoi Street on a Tuesday morning when I was also buying incense and rice, paying cash, looking like an old woman running ordinary errands. I had filled it, by the end, with 41 pages of evidence, and the notes of a woman who had not waited and had not panicked but had simply organized, sequenced, built her case the way she had always built everything steadily, in layers, until it was ready. I would leave the notebook to Carolyn, not because she needed it, but because she had been the keeper of the sealed envelope for 11 months without asking what was inside, and she deserved to know the full shape of what she had helped hold together. I would leave the house to no one yet. The house was mine. I was 68 years old and in good health, and the jasmine was blooming on the windowsill, and the dark green shutters were still exactly the color I had chosen 32 years ago, and the window in the back bedroom would stay slightly open on rainy nights for as long as I was here to leave it open. There was no hurry. Outside, the street sounds of Fan Din Feng moved through the evening the way they always had: motorbikes, voices, the distant bell of a vendor making her last pass of the day. The city did not know or care what had been decided in a fourth-floor conference room or a courtroom on a Thursday morning. It continued, as it always continued, indifferent and full. I was not indifferent. I was exactly where I had always been in this house, at this altar. In this life, built bone by bone over 32 years, with a man who had understood that everything worth keeping was built slowly and held quietly and defended not with force but with the simple, irrefutable weight of what was true. The incense ash was gray and still. Min's face watched from the honest light. My father used to say, "Still water runs deepest." He meant it about patience. He meant it about the kind of strength that does not announce itself, that simply holds what it holds, that does not need to raise its voice because it has already done what needed to be done, long before anyone else understood that the doing had begun. I had been still water my entire life. I was still water now, and I was not finished. If anyone has ever looked at you and seen only your age, your silence, your willingness to give and mistook all of that for weakness, this story was for you. The ones who stay quiet are not the ones who have nothing left. They are the ones who are still deciding exactly when to speak. If Miriam's story stayed with you, please give this video a like and subscribe so we can keep bringing you stories about the strength that lives in quiet places. And we'd love to hear from you. Do you believe that when someone truly loves you, they will always show it in the way they treat what you've worked your whole life to build?